everyone, so this video is going to cover between me and Layla, a very hyper dog, is going to cover the term kinship, which is one of the key concepts I'm teaching in class right now at CUNY Brooklyn College. Alright, so to get a definition straight from kinship, coming from this textbook by Kenneth on cultural anthropology, kinship is, quote, the system of meaning and power that cultures create to determine who is related to whom and to define their mutual expectations, rights, and responsibilities. So the key kind of thing here is system of meaning and power that cultures create to determine who is related to whom. So it's different understandings of family. Often in anthropology, you see a lot of a particular approach to kinship, which includes a lot of maps of different genealogical structures of families. So again, going back to my family here with my parents, I also have a brother. We can use all sorts of symbols here, but just to give a really simple example, I'm just going to use gendered symbols here. We can think of my dad, right? And then we draw a line to say he's married to my mom. And then we can do a line down to show that they had 2 kids, my brother and me. And on these charts, you refer to the person from whose perspective you're drawing the map as the ego. So there's my brother and me. So you see a lot of these sorts of charts. You can find these all over Anthropology. That is from pages 244 to 245 on the 2020 edition of the textbook by Kenneth. And now to quote a passage from page 242. As early anthropologists gathered kinship data from cultures worldwide, and by early we mean early to mid-1900s, largely in the anthropologists based in the US and in England, they developed a limited number of general categories that facilitated comparison. Despite vast geographic differences and language differences, only 4 primary systems were identified to classify relatives in the parental generation: lineal, bifurcate merging, generational, and bifurcate collateral. When beginning with the ego's generation, the ego being the central character and starting point in tracing kinship relationships, for example, you and your own family tree, as I modeled earlier with my nuclear family, anthropologists found only 6 different ways of organizing relatives, in which the variation centered on the classification of siblings and cousins. Each of these 6 were named after a key group in which the pattern occurred, which was shown in those images I showed before. So the names of those 6 groups are Eskimo, Hawaiian, Sudanese, Omaha, Crow, and Iroquois. So one of these 6 kinship patterns that earlier anthropologists identify, that's common among Sudanese people. Here, again, quoting from page 244 in the kind of Gust textbook, the 2020 edition. Quote, the Sudanese kinship system is the most complex. Each category of relative is given a distinct term or a distinct word based on genealogical distance from the ego. There can be 8 different cousin terms, 8 different words to refer to your cousins, all of which are distinguished from ego's brother and sister. Close quote. So basically, there's lots of different ways of understanding kinship relationships, and also all sorts of ways naming those kinship relationships. Again, quoting Guest on page 242. Generalized systems of kinship classification can be very useful for identifying and comparing broad patterns of social structure, but anthropologists have found that actual local kinship patterns do not always match the generalized models. That's with most things in life. The ways in which human groups trace connections between generations, in other words, how they construct genealogies, can be messy and far from exact. Genealogies are full of gaps, interruptions, disruptions, uncertainties, and imagined or assumed connections. Some groups have extensive genealogies, but even these carefully constructed records may be partly mythical and based on limited recollections or partial history. In contrast, other groups may have extremely shallow genealogical memories that span only 2 or 3 generations. Segments of these descent groups may no longer live together or act together. Other relatives may have been forgotten or excluded from the main line through conflict. Political, economic, and/or military upheaval, colonial interventions, and the establishment of modern nation-states may have disrupted collective memory and records, or kinship patterns may have changed over time as groups adapted to external pressures. As a result, these groups' knowledge of individual ancestors and even whole generations may have been lost. There's different relationships in terms of who is more significant and what sorts of different expectations, rights, and responsibilities people have with different relatives in their families, and those differences across various cultures. In terms of, for example, who you should marry or not, who should act like your primary caregiver or mentor, if there's any inheritance, is any inheritance passed down through the men in the family, or perhaps the women in the family, or perhaps not following gendered lineages within the family. So, the primary relationships of kinship units or groups can be traced through a combination of, for example, what you might refer to as your blood relatives, in addition as well to adoption, to someone who became someone's primary caretaker but is perhaps not, quote, blood related to them. So this is a picture of my parents circa 1980 something in Upper Michigan or Wisconsin somewhere. These I would consider my blood relatives, my parents. The primary relationships of kinship units often are understood through marriage, for example, as well as genealogical ties across generations to ethnicity or notion of a common ancestor or a common place of ancestry. My main ancestry from my parents is between Ireland, Hungary, France, some other places in Europe. And we can also understand the production of different categorizations of race or racialization as well in relation to different notions of ancestry. And you can also understand these primary relationships of kinship units in relation to social, political, and or economic connections. So you might understand people that you are you've grown very close to through personal or social relationships. You might also understand or feel sort of kinship or, family relationship, maybe sisterhood or brotherhood, right, with someone who you see as having political solidarity with. For example, one thing that has made me feel a lot of solidarity with people lately has been this campaign, which students who I've taught have probably seen me carrying this around in class. In Spanish, this says, "Y la culpa no era mía, ni donde estaba, ni como vestía, y violador eres tú," which translates to, "And the fault wasn't mine, nor where I was, nor how I dressed. The rapist is you." It's a movement of mostly women and femme people that started in Chile, in Santiago, Chile. And you can also think about kinship relationships between people in power, between the president, between CEOs of major companies, and what they see as, sorry, that was my dog, what they see as having kind of common mutual relationships. So ideas of who is related to whom, a family, ancestry, genealogy, descent, and how people are related to each other are all socially and culturally constructed, both in terms of how we understand our kinship networks and our kin, the people within these networks, and how we understand those of other people, and general ideas of what kinship is, what family is, what ancestry is. It's another thing that anthropologists have really emphasized, which is a very different approach to kinship than in the reading that our class was talking about from Karen Ho. So let's take a quote from Karen Ho and see how she's talking about kinship in her chapter called Biographies of Hegemony. Itself a very interesting concept. On page 60, Karen Ho writes in her Ethnography on Wall Street, Liquidated, an Ethnography of Wall Street. She writes, "As Wall Street investment banks profited exorbitantly from their increasing influence over corporate America in the 1980s, they began to recruit at elite universities on a grand scale, making the 2-year analyst programs for the express purpose of targeting undergraduates directly out of college. This new cadre of workers, no longer handpicked through small-scale networks of family, friends, and close business associates, was legitimated by placing even greater cachet or
prestige
on the universities where they were recruited. In place of the elite, individualized family of men came the elite Princeton or Harvard family, which relied on a new variant of kinship based on alumni rather than old boys networks. And that's from page 60 in Karen Ho's book published in 2009. So this is an understanding of kinship based on alumni of elite universities, specifically MBA or Masters in Business alumni, graduates. So we're thinking about these alumni who are then, as Karen Ho writes about, who are then recruited to be investment bankers on Wall Street, positioning them as people with massive direct influence on the U.S. economy, on the global economy, and then all sorts of ripple effects that these economies have, right? Meanwhile, their smartness and ability to do the job well is generally accepted as common sense within hegemonic ideologies, as Karen Ho describes. So rather than focusing on charting individual relationships between various people in a family, what Karen Ho is focusing on is kinship in relation to hegemony, which is a concept we learned earlier in the semester. A shorthand definition that we can use is, here quoting from Nielsen, which I'll cite at the end, quote, a system of meaning in a situation or a society that overshadows and dominates other meaning systems, close quote. Now, to quote from another author, Klein, in a 2016 article, again cited at the end of this video, quote, as Gramsci, 1971, explained, ... hegemony is, now he's quoting Gramsci, characterized by the combination of force and consent. Indeed, the attempt is always to ensure that force would be based on the consent of the majority. Close quote from Gramsci, and continuing on with Klein. Consequently, this measure of control depends upon the subordinate groups following of an even sense of ownership over the same social norms that govern them. Therefore, a more complete understanding of hegemony encompasses, and here Klein is now quoting Goldberg, the success of the dominant classes in presenting their definition of reality, their view of the world, in such a way that is accepted by other classes as common sense. Close quote of both Goldberg and Klein there. So going back to Karen Ho's chapter, she's talking about this idea that there can be biographies of hegemony. We might think about biographies of hegemony as, in other words, so biographies, so narrations of the lives of people so who are from, become part of, or drive forward, produce, reproduce. Hegemony, a dominant meaning system generally accepted among a massive group of people as common sense. In that way, we can understand the relationship between notions of kinship and the production and reproduction of hegemony, specifically in this case, in those who hold powerful positions at Wall Street that control a lot of what happens in the U.S. and global economy. And another big question to consider is who identifies with them? With Wall Street bankers at high positions, with the current president, Trump, and other people of what we may call the ruling class. In relation to race, class, gender, who sees them as their kin? Karen Ho published this ethnography in 2009, 1 year after the financial crash in 2008. Now we are reading this in 2020, during the onset of the largest financial crisis since then, possibly bigger. So that is the concept of kinship, and a really interesting way of understanding it in relation to Karen Ho's chapter on biographies of hegemony in her book, Liquidated, an Ethnography of Wall Street.